Catholic cardinals enter the sealed conclave this Wednesday to pick the next pope. 133 scarlet-clad men won't be debating or discussing anymore, but casting secret ballots to pick the 267th pontiff. The next head of the Catholic Church needs a 2/3 majority to be elected. It is a process that could take anything from a few hours to weeks. This time, there seems to be quite a divide between potential candidates, those who want to see the church change and open up, and those who want to return to a more austere religion that is less accepting of divorce, gay people or women. Well, to get a better insight on that, we are joined by former President of Ireland, who after serving 2 terms as head of state, went on to get a doctorate in canon law. Mary McAleese, thanks so much for your time and joining us here on France 24. Can I start by asking you, as these men meet, which way do you think it may go? Will it be progressive or traditionalist?
That I don't know. I don't think it's possible to predict. But if they are courageous and if they have the future of the church strongly in mind, then it seems to me the idea of going back to some nostalgic traditional place where old ways worked, and we know they didn't, not very well, then I think if they go backwards, then I think the church is in even worse trouble existentially than it is now. They've been kicking so many cans down the road, really since the time of John the 23rd, in particular the issue of women, which has been hanging around the church and over the church since Pope John the 23rd first drew attention to the fact that they would have to deal with, as the world would have to deal with, the gender equality, the equality of women. And Pope Francis really was the Pope who, like the little boy in the Dutch story, had his finger in the dike. Without that, I think the tsunami of discontent, fueled also, of course, by the scandals that have irreparably broken trust between the faithful and what we call the magisterium, that is the bishops, the teachers of the church, the bishops, the cardinals and the Pope. I think that should weigh heavily on their minds. We expect, of course, that the church, as Pope Francis did, would have that great compassion for the poor, the migrant, the prisoner, the overlooked, the neglected, the forgotten, would have the care for the earth. All of those things we expect. That's the church talking out to the wide world in the name of Christ. But internally is where its problem exists, where the absence of human rights for church members who are women, who are gay, who are trans, who are divorced, who have had abortions, all of these things should weigh heavily on their minds, because a church which fails to deal with the human rights of its people is a church that at the end of the day lacks credibility. Even looking today at this gathering of men, the theatre of it, it doesn't look like the 21st century, does it? This gathering exclusively of men, no women involved in selecting the Pope, very, very few involved even in Pope Francis's funeral. That has got to change, or the existential crisis that gender inequality and indeed the absence of human rights for members of the church currently poses will overwhelm. The waters will flow over the top of the dike.
You mentioned that, Pope Francis was seen as a progressive on many issues. I know you yourself called on him to address the place of women in the church. But what did he, even one of the more progressive popes, actually do?
Not a lot is the answer. I mean, he thought like people back in the 1960s and 70s, confronted with the issue of gender equality, men in charge of corporations, in charge of governments, in charge of all sorts of institutions, thought that by tapping a token woman here and there, that would solve the problem, and that they would have a photo op and say, oh, look at me, how good I am, I've appointed this woman to a job. Well, Francis did that. I mean, he appointed a small number of women to modest jobs within the church, within the Curia, for example. He also it has to be said, and appointed a number of women delegates to the synod and gave them the opportunity to vote there. Their numbers were tiny, of course. They were completely outnumbered by the male bishops. So there was no actual equality as such. It was pure tokenism. On the other hand, it was a sign of the pressure that he was under to respond to that tsunami of desire by not just women in the church, but people who are human rights literate in the church, that you cannot continue to preach Christ as the all-embracing, loving Father if he only loves people who are male, if he loves them more than he loves women. I don't believe that for one moment, but that is the image of the church today. The image of the church is a place where women are second class. I don't think that's a good look for Christ, and it's not going to work for the church of the future. This is the end of the road in many ways. They either get this right, or I think they are in infinitely worse trouble than they were under Benedict or Francis.
Indeed, it sounds like potentially women should start their own parallel church where they would be able to have a proper place.
Well, no, I don't think that's the answer either. I mean, I think this institution has managed to survive all sorts of ups and downs and crises and corruption and stupidities and vanities for many, many centuries. And many of us stick around despite huge provocation to leave, but we stick with it because at the end of the day, you are dealing with an institution, the biggest NGO in the world, the biggest Christian denomination in the world. And it has such influence and power over 5 continents, influence on culture, influence on laws. Not always benign influence, it has to be said, but sometimes, yes, benign, sometimes for the good, sometimes in terms of education and welfare and care for those who are overlooked by other peoples and institutions and governments. All of that is to the good, but there is the dark side. And that dark side is the vanity of really a bunch of men, a group of men making decisions for 1.4 billion people, including half of them women, without reference to them. The process that was initiated by Francis of synodality opened a tiny, tiny window of hope that there might be the opportunity in the future for much greater collaboration with women and with those who believe firmly that the church's failure to deal with human rights, the rights of its own people, its own members, to freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, freedom of expression, freedom to choose religion, freedom to change religion, all of those things that are not recognized, indeed are contradicted by church teaching. There is a hope that synodality may allow the church to deal with those. But it has to move much more quickly now, because this is a world of highly educated and human rights literate people. Mm-hmm. And the old days of, sticking the finger in the dike and, if you like, electing people who are placeholders, that will not work. We need a man of courage, real courage, who can lead the church to the egalitarianism, the equality that many of us believe Christ promised and stands for, but the church does not.
And briefly, Ms. McAleese, I know that you began your doctorate on canon law looking at children's rights, because when you finished being President of Ireland, that was when we were getting wind of all the scandals in the Catholic Church. Again, what are children's rights under that canon law? What are we seeing the church do?
Well, children are as members of the church and have rights, but unfortunately they also have huge obligations, and those obligations are imposed on them at baptism. And most people are baptized as babies, and there is a huge question there, a massive question about the right of any institution to impose lifelong obligations on non-sentient children. Baptism, you could say it splits into 2 separate spheres. One is the sphere where the divine and grace enters, and that's all, if you like, a gift. You don't have to actually do anything. But the other side of baptism is that you become a member of the church for life. You can't leave without a penalty, and you're obliged to obey these men and these bishops and their teachings, into which you have no input, no say, no opportunity for your word, your voice to be heard. So I think that's a big problem. In fact, that's an even bigger existential problem facing the church. It is the church's, that is to say, the bishops' failure, not the failure of the laity, because the laity are very well advanced in their thinking on this. But these men who live in that kind of, that bishop's bubble, as it were, who are not literate in the human rights that we are, all of us, guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But unfortunately, church law denies to its members, including children, and probably especially children.
Mary McAleese, former President of Ireland, doctorate in canon law, thank you so much for joining us here on France 24.
A pleasure, thank you.